Okay, I haven't done a video recently about my book. I continue to. This is now the second proof. It looks exactly like the first, so it's not like coming out of my skin with improvements, a lot of improvements. And yet, here's the thing, when I got to the later chapters of that book, working on improving them, and then I went back to chapter 1 and chapter 2. In my opinion, my style in the earlier chapters is more simplistic. Kind of leaves me with this meh feeling, you know. So I did I've been working on chapter 2, which doesn't really have a huge change. It's just, there's some change, but not really a radical change. Chapter 1, I have done a radical change too. There used to be 2 short scenes and then a long scene. And now there is just one scene, the third scene, which is the long scene in the original, incorporating flashbacks from the first 2 scenes that Galen experiences in the present of the third scene. And it's kind of tricky when you write flashbacks. I think it takes a skilled writer to pull it off, which I don't know if I'm to that level or not. So what I was hoping that I could get maybe some comments from you guys. I'm not going to read the entire chapter 1, the original, but I'm going to read the first 2 scenes and introducing the third scene, as it was before. At least in the most recent rewrite up until now. The version you guys have heard on YouTube, I have that chapter I'm reading that chapter on YouTube, is an older version. It has since been revised, but it's still pretty much the same idea. I want to read that, and then I want to read the new version, maybe not all the way through, but up to the part where the big changes finish. And mostly I want you guys, if you listen to this, the second part especially, to try to imagine in your mind the scene that I'm trying to convey. And tell me if I pull off the flashbacks, the part where Galen is remembering stuff. Is it clear to you when he is remembering stuff versus what is going on in the present? Are you not losing touch with the present because I'm taking you into a flashback? So that's my question. Basically, in general, I would like to know which version is more interesting, reads more smoothly, and just better. I like to think the second one, but it's hard to be objective. So I'm hoping to get your opinion. So without further ado, here is the original chapter 1, and then I will follow it with the revised chapter 1. Galen Laval tottered alongside the slumped cabin's exterior, his left hand clutching his staff. Blood, stiffening within his beard, tightened the skin below his lower lip. With his forearm he scrubbed at his mouth, then paused beside the cabin's front window. A salty stench bit his nostrils, overwhelming the scents of the forest. From inside the little cabin he caught the faint buzzing of flies. Trembling, he opened the gore-stained fingers of his right hand and let the broken axe fall. Wind harried the trees beyond the cabin, bending the stumpy bluebarks to its will. Galen lifted his staff and thrust himself from the wall, and the only home he had known in his 19 years. Shivering, clad in just his tunic and worn black leggings, Galen plunged among the frozen trees, blindly drove himself headlong from the site of Seth Laval's murder. He fled into blue-gray shadow, cleaving bracken and rough greenberry, sobbing for breath as he raced below the reach of the midday sun. Downward he shambled, skidding, half falling through cloveleaf, its berry cluster staining his tattered sleeves a dark blue. A tree root stopped him, catching the toe of his boot. With a yell he pitched forward, falling hard upon his elbows. Galen rolled and then sat trembling with legs spread. Through a haze of fatigue he studied the trail before him, a narrow track stamped out by deer. He stared at the darkening bruise between his right thumb and forefinger. Again he felt the axe's worn handle in his hand, the weight of its head adding momentum to each stroke, the yielding resistance as the blade struck. With a shudder he raised his knees to his chest. "They won't find out," he vowed to himself. "No one comes up here." Blue light pulsed from his staff lying close beside him, from the sky-colored gem gripped by talons at Mornius's crown. Galen clambered up from the leaves, trembling at the sudden warmth of power soothing his muscles, the clearing of mist from his sight. His staff rang hollow on the trail when he planted it, reminding him how close winter was. He lurched to his feet and again pressed forward, crashing through fern stalks as thick as his wrist. "Bluebarks first, then king skies," he muttered as he went. "Winter whites next, and then—" He shook his head and stumbled to a stop. "Kitterin," he said softly, "a place with streets, not trees, and people." Galen shrank back. He pressed against the wide base of a trunk, staring up through branches at the brooding sky. "What if they hurt me?" he whispered. "Fancy walking stick you got there, boy." Galen, cowering behind his staff, raised his free arm to shield his face. "Leave me alone." "Tss, now," said the smithy with a sneer. "What's with all the blood, eh? Kill a pig?" Galen pressed against the livery's outer wall. His voice, when it came, seemed muted to his ears, drowned out by the throb of his heartbeat. "I told you," he said. "I murdered your worker, Seth Laval. Now go and report me." With a snort, the smithy stomped off. Trembling, Galen lowered his head. The citizens of Kitterin streamed by without stopping, their gazes averted, shielded from his plight. In their eyes he was a vagrant, starving and off his head, and reeking of old blood. Only the rain failed to shun him. Cool and caressing, it washed through his hair. Leather creaked as a man crouched before him. Galen tensed, expecting the smithy. He focused on his arms, the pinkish rain sluicing over his wrists. The newcomer tapped his shoulder, speaking gently. "Hard times in Kitterin, aren't they?" Galen flicked his gaze upward to the stranger's face, then dropped his head. He studied his hands, the pale white gleam of his knuckles beneath his freckled skin. "You're freezing." The man bent close, water trickling in rivulets from leather guards across his shoulders and arms. "Why aren't you home?" "I don't have." Galen thumped his shoulders against the wall. "I'm not." Again he made the attempt. Voice quivering, he described how he had taken Seth Laval's axe, and how, in blind fury and fear, he had hacked the older man to pieces. Leaning forward, the stranger probed his shattered cheekbone gently beneath his hair. "Seth Laval did this? I'd no idea he had a stepson." Galen winced at the pain the man roused in his cheek. "He kept me hidden on Mount Deshea." "Was this in self-defense? Did he attack you?" Galen shivered. Numb from exposure as he was, he still felt hungry winter, closing teeth on late fall. "No," he gritted the word. Then fingers caught his left wrist, pushing back the threadbare sleeves of his filthy tunic. He shivered at the stranger's touch, how the man traced the scars along his forearm. "Years," the stranger breathed. Galen's face burned. He brushed aside the intrusive hand. "The enforcers won't see me," he said, "and I've nothing else. I can't go back home." "Later," the man said. "You'll catch your death out here. Up, let's go." Hands, both firm and gentle, raised him to his feet. Galen tottered, but the larger man supported and turned him. As comrades, they stumbled through the rain. "There," said Tarek Florin. He settled back on his chair, placing the wet, soiled cloth as far as he could from their steaming bowls of stew. Galen glanced at Tarek across the table. In the cavern's yellow light, the man's eyes were hazel, not brown, as he had first thought, filled with motes of fire, a fierce determination belying his kindness. Around them both other men pressed close, reeking of peasant roy and worse, the potato brew favored by his stepfather. Despite himself, Galen cringed. Okay, so that was the first version. There was no fancy, snazzy writing going on, just clear cut. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Okay, and that's the way this chapter's been since its inception. It's never changed. So here's my bold attempt to change it and combine the three scenes. In the third scene that I didn't read, that's when Tarek talks to Galen about his army and, I'd take you under my wing except ... And then, anyway, okay, so that's the original. Now here is the revised chapter 1. It's not completely perfect because I just rewrote it yesterday, but it's probably as close to as what I want as I can get it at this point. Chapter 1. Tottering alongside the cabin's slumped exterior, Galen clutched his staff. Blood, stiffening within his beard, tightened the skin below his lower lip. With his forearm he scrubbed at his mouth, pausing outside the cabin's front window. A salty stench bit his nostrils, overwhelming the scents of the high mountain trees. Through the crack under the door he caught the faint buzzing of flies. Trembling, he opened his gore-stained fingers, let the broken axe fall. Murderer, he wanted to cry, but the persistent rap of knuckles on wood jerked up his head. Bewildered, he stared through a haze of memory at the man seated opposite him across the little table. A man in his late 20s, he guessed, kind enough to rescue him from the frigid rain. I said, repeated the stranger, with an air of dwindling patience, I'm Tarek Florn, son of Chase. My father owns Vale Horse. And you are? Fingering his staff, Galen met the man's hazel eyes. Exhausted, his mind was reeling, snatching him from the present to what he had done with his own frail hands. His stepfather, Seth Laval, sprawled face down, screaming, dragging himself through a thick swath of blood. You are? The man repeated. Galen fought his gaze into focus on the other's bearded face. Laval, he said, his voice rusty from lack of use. Galen, he added, frowning. After years of being called Thing or It, his real name lived far away in another time. Furtively, he glanced at the steaming bowl before him, his stomach twisting into knots as he leaned back, staring despondent into his lap. He studied the bruise on his hand he held out of sight beneath the table, feeling again the axe's splintered handle, the weight of its head adding momentum to his strokes, the yielding resistance when it struck. With a shudder he raised his head, blinking to clear his sight. In the tavern's amber light his companion's eyes were hazel, not brown, Galen realized, filled with motes of fire, a fierce determination belying his kindness. Around their table, set apart from the wall, large men were pressing close, reeking of peasant roy or worse, the potato brew favored by his stepfather. Despite himself, Galen cringed, tilted his staff closer, and pressed it to his breast. I had a friend near Kitterin, his companion said, eyeing him, who owned a gracken he raised from a cub. He gave it love, kept it gentle, but after his death his younger brother took charge. You've heard this story, Galen? You know it? Galen shook his head. He did not want to know. More and more men were crowding the tavern. Trembling, he fixed his gaze on the kind stranger opposite him. No, he has a name, Galen chided himself. Tarek Florn. And now Galen read anger in his gold-flecked eyes. The gracken was starved, said Tarek, neglected. Mitar's brother had a cruel streak and liked to hear it howl, until one day the gracken ripped out Alandari's throat. I know, because I found him torn to pieces in their barn. Galen stared at the rag beside his bowl, tinged with blood from his hands, reminders of Seth Laval. Beside it steamed the stew he could not bring himself to eat. "Was the beast destroyed?" he asked, raising his voice over the tavern's din. Tarek frowned, as if realizing the point of his tale misfired. Galen lowered his spoon, rotated it slowly in his stew. "Eat up," said Tarek, reaching to tap his fingers holding the spoon. "We need to talk." Galen studied his food while the older man ate, letting his mind wander and his rust-colored hair drop over his eyes. Numbly he glanced out the window at the darkening twilight. He recalled his arrival earlier that day, his first time seeing buildings or people. He shivered, feeling again the driving rain, how uncontrollably he trembled, stumbling from the trees, his hands and tunic stained with blood. Blinded by fatigue, he had blundered into the hard reality of a wall, in exhaustion slumping into a bony heap before the building. Townsfolk strode by him without stopping, their gazes averted. To them he was a vagrant, suspicious, starving and off his head, reeking of old blood. Only the freezing rain failed to shun him. Promising death, it rippled through his hair. Hard times in Kitterin, aren't they? Galen shivered in his chair, watching the rain turn to snow outside the tavern's little window. He remembered sitting in the icy rain, flicking his gaze to the stranger's face, then dropping his head to study his knuckles under his freckled skin. The man had bent close, water trickling in rivulets from leather guards across his shoulders and arms. "Why aren't you home?" "I don't have." He thumped his shoulders against the wall. Galen recalled confessing his crime, how he had taken Seth Laval's axe and in fury and fear hacked his stepfather to pieces. Yet rather than rebuke him, the man he knew now as Tarek had reached to probe his shattered cheekbone. Seth Laval did this? I'd no idea he had a stepson. Galen winced at the remembered pain in his cheek. Across the little table he saw Tarek take a swig of his ale, yet in his head the memory played. He recalled his own voice saying, "He kept me on Mount Deshea." Was this self-defense? Did he attack you? Tarek's fingers had caught his left wrist, pushing back the threadbare sleeve of his tunic. Galen shivered, remembering how the older man had traced his embarrassing scars. "Years," Tarek breathed. Galen's face burned in the tavern, as it had then when he thrust aside Tarek's hand. "The enforcers won't see me," he had said, "and I can't go home." "Later," Tarek replied, and now his voice was distant, the memory fading. Galen, eyes closed, strained to catch Tarek's final words. "Come, you'll catch your death out here. Let's go." Galen looked to the man finishing up his stew. Tarek, he thought, recalling how as comrades they had stumbled through the rain. Nervous, he glanced around him at the noisy tavern. Did Seth Laval come here? He wondered. How many of these men were his friends? As Tarek set down his spoon, Galen peered again at him from under his matted hair. "I can't eat until I confess," he admitted finally. "I just want to get it over. I can't live with what I've done. Will you help me? The enforcers will listen to you." Across from him, staring down at his hands as he wiped them slowly with his cloth, Tarek frowned. "Am I to understand you're asking to die?" Galen looked at the untouched bowl before him and nodded. "Well, forget it," Tarek snapped. "There's more to this story, Galen Laval. You don't look like a killer to me." Leaning his weight against the creaky back of his chair, Tarek eyed him. "If only you were stronger, I'd recruit you," he mused aloud. "I need warriors, criminals or not. You have no home and nowhere to go. I'd take you on, but for your own safety I can't let myself—" "That's fine," Galen interjected, glancing up at his staff's wooden shaft to its crown of talons above his head. "I don't want to be a burden." "Let me finish." Tarek reached across the table, and Galen stiffened as the larger man brushed aside his tangled hair. "You're no warrior," Tarek said, eyeing him, "and I'm headed to war. I'd only endanger your life by bringing you." "I could help." Nervous, Galen fingered his staff. "Don't you need hired hands?" You're what, 14? You've no beard. 19, said Galen with a toss of his head. I'm 19. Well, you've been imprisoned up on that mountain. Look at you, scared, just sitting there. Have you never seen people? Trembling, Galen stared into the other's eyes. No, he admitted. I've never seen anyone. At that, Tarek grimaced. No surprise then that you seem younger, and this leads me back to my problem. I've aided you with food, or I will if you ever eat it. So what, I just leave you here homeless, out in the cold? Which, come to think on it, why didn't you freeze to death coming down that mountain? And you did it in one day? Galen glanced again toward his staff, and the blue stone flared at its crown, flickered hotly in response. Across the table, Tarek inhaled sharply, blinking at the gem's sudden radiance. Reaching out, he looked to Galen for permission, then reverently touched the staff. This is old, Tarek said. Familiar, too. I know this. Gently, he tilted it toward him to examine the rounded gem within its iron talons. I studied artifacts from Earth in one of my classes at university. There are many. He shook his head. If you travel any distance, Galen, you will see there are even whole buildings from Earth strewn across this world. Little things like stones are lesser known, but the elves would know this. Is this yours? My father gave it to my mother before his death, Galen told him. He was murdered by Seth Laval. I can't explain it, but holding it always makes me stronger or warmer when I'm cold. Do you know it has a name? Tarek asked. If I'm not mistaken, this is Mornius you hold, and that gem is a skystone, a relic from Earth. It contains... Galen blinked, seeing the sudden intensity on Tarek's face, the flick of his eyes in warning. The older man stared past him and up, his eyes going hard. Then Galen heard it, the low creak of the floorboards beneath him. He sensed the presence of someone large close behind, looming over his head. Okay, well, I want to keep reading, but I'm going to stop there so you guys don't forget. You can think of the two things that you just heard. The flashback, I try to leave it in an obvious way with Galen's training to remember Tarek's last words. And then from this point on, it's just a nice normal chapter. It doesn't go back in time, or there's no flashbacks. It's just straight writing. So, which one? Which one is better? The one with the flashbacks or the one that's just straight? Scene 1, Scene 2, Scene 3. I would really be curious to know if people want to give me their opinions. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye!